The cartons were not heavy, but they weighed on me like a preordained fate. Two cardboard lids sagged under the weight of family portraits, Arthur's uniform, the correspondences my mother had lovingly preserved. I carried them up the steps of the residence on Oak Ridge Avenue, the very porch where I had once watched my children etch crayon suns onto the planks. Eleanor met me at the entryway before I could even knock. She didn't shriek. She never had to. Her voice sliced through the air in a deliberate, clinical way. "You are not permitted inside this dwelling until you offer an apology." She did not specify for what. She did not need to. We both knew it was about her gown, a fabrication repeated twice until it took on the semblance of truth. Behind the screen door, Michael stood with his arms folded, his gaze fixed on the floorboards, following the grain as if it were of greater importance than my face. I waited for him to clear his throat, to gesture me in, to utter something that would clarify this as a misunderstanding. Nothing was said. I informed him I had brought the containers he had requested, the ones from the attic. He did not move. Eleanor's arms tightened, a barrier. My throat felt constricted, but I bent down regardless, nudging the nearest box with the toe of my shoe. I stepped back, lifted them one by one, and transported them to the car. My knees ached, but my spine remained straight. 45 years of inhabiting those quarters, and now I stood outside like a trespasser. I placed the cartons in the trunk, shut it gently, and slid into the driver's seat. The rhododendrons blossomed blue against the fence, Arthur's present from decades earlier. I turned the ignition, and as the engine purred to life, a realization became clear. By dusk, this abode would no longer be theirs to prevent me from entering. The conflict had begun at the barbecue 2 weeks before, when the smoke from Michael's new propane grill drifted across the yard and neighbors congregated around paper plates. Eleanor had selected a pale silk dress, not the kind of attire you'd wear near an open flame or children with condiment bottles. Yet she made a performance of brushing at the material halfway through the evening. Turning to the group with a practiced scowl, she said she had caught it, gesturing toward me just prior to dinner. Conversation stalled. I felt every head pivot. I recalled bumping the cedar bench, the one Michael had installed only days before, its edges still rough. I said as much, even proposed to cover the cost of a repair. But Eleanor waved me off with a smile that was not a smile. "It's fine," she told me, then recounted the tale to anyone who would listen. By the time dessert arrived, her damaged gown had become the central topic of the night. That was her method. Nothing boisterous, never crude, just subtle alterations until the room accepted them as fact. My armchair in their parlor had vanished months ago, replaced by something from a catalog. When I inquired about it, Eleanor explained it didn't align with the new layout. During meals, when I spoke, her voice often glided in over mine, completing a sentence I hadn't finished. The snag dress became the pretext she required, a minor fabrication refined into a public truth. Now it served as a condition for my return, the evidence that I was the problem, the reason Michael kept his eyes on the floor. I drove back from the porch with that memory echoing louder than their silence, and I knew I had to gather the paperwork that still bore my name.
The residence was quiet when I returned, the kind of stillness that carried reminiscence rather than tranquility. I set the boxes on the kitchen table, the very table Arthur had sanded by hand when we first moved in. At precisely 4:10 p.m., the light streamed through the western window, cutting across the surface in its familiar line. I had timed it so often I no longer needed a timepiece. I lifted the lid from the first container. Arthur's leather journal lay on top, the one he used to scribble to-do lists in a compact hand. Replace faucet valve, fix porch rail, Lubricate gate latch. Beneath those practical notations were smaller ones, half hidden in the margin. Plan anniversary getaway. Call florist. His script looked as vital as the day he pressed the pen down. Next came baby pictures of Michael and Brianna, curls plastered to foreheads after baths, faces smudged with frosting from birthdays I can still taste. I paused over each one, tracing their edges. In another envelope sat decades of Franklin County tax receipts, each stamped paid with my name beneath the total. I spread them out like a deck of cards. Finally, at the bottom of the box, the deed. Tenancy in common, executed after Arthur's funeral when Michael had insisted it would be simpler. I hadn't contested it then. I was too exhausted, too raw. But tucked into the file was the clause Arthur had insisted on: life use reserved to Doris Ellington, my right to live, to occupy, to decide. I dialed the number of the bank and requested Ethan Joe, patient, deliberate. He walked me through the terminology. Your share is yours, Mrs. Ellington. That clause gives you control. If you choose to sell, you can. His voice was steady, not surprised. He gave me the name of a lawyer on Court Street, Mark Bell, someone who specialized in property transfers. After I hung up, I sat very still. The sorrow of Arthur's absence pressed in, sudden as it had been the day he left the kitchen table mid-soup and never returned. Yet with the grief came clarity. The title was not a restraint. It was a key. And if I chose to turn it, no one could prevent me from entering that door again. The next morning, I gathered the file and walked downtown to Mark Bell's office. His office overlooked Court Street, the blinds half drawn against the late summer glare. He read the deed with the diligence of a man who had witnessed too many families tear themselves apart over assets. His glasses slid down his nose as he traced Arthur's life use clause with a fingertip. Your son can dispute the price, he said, his tone even. He can contest whether the valuation is fair, but the sale itself, that's yours to approve. This clause secures it. The words landed like a judgment. I set the thick folder of receipts on his desk, each one displaying my name and signature across 40 decades of taxes. He leafed through them slowly, nodded once, and returned them to their order. You sustained this home, he added quietly. The record makes that evident. I carried the documents home and arranged them on the dining table. The kitchen still had a faint scent of blackberry pie from the night before, but the sweetness no longer softened the bitterness. I dialed the number Teresa had given me weeks earlier, a broker she trusted. Helen Lane, the voice answered, curt but amiable. I explained the situation in careful sentences, holding the phone steady with one hand and Arthur's notebook in the other. She listened without interrupting, then asked, Do you want visibility or do you want speed? I said, and no spectacle. We settled on a private viewing, discreet but comprehensive. Helen promised to bring an inspector she trusted, someone who understood the quirks of houses built in the early 80s. She would walk the rooms herself before listing. When I ended the call, I stood at the window. The rhododendrons swayed in the breeze. The plan was no longer an abstract concept. It had substance, form, momentum. By the conclusion of the week, it would be progressing without me. That evening, my phone vibrated twice, first with Michael's name. Don't escalate this. As if betrayal could be quantified by size, as if a few inches of silence were smaller than 45 years of devotion. Minutes later, Eleanor's message followed, brief and neat. We'll accept your apology tomorrow. I opened Mark's email, scanned the bolded clause that carried Arthur's resolve, and pressed send. They would have their reply in a legal form, not from my tongue. The kitchen grew dim, but I pulled flour from the pantry and butter from the refrigerator. My hands worked from memory. folding dough, sugaring fruit. The pastry was for no one but myself, though when Teresa Miller stopped by with produce from her garden, I cut us both a slice. She tasted it, then said softly, "Things flourish where they're cultivated." After she left, I pulled 2 boxes from the hall closet and set them on the table. On one, I wrote in black marker, "Items that belong to me." On the other, "Not coming with me." Arthur's wristwatch went into the first. As reliable as ever, a novelty apron from Eleanor slid into the second without hesitation. By the time the oven cooled, the lines had been drawn. Tomorrow would bring strangers into the house, but tonight the selection had already begun.
Helen arrived just after breakfast, punctual and efficient, with a man she introduced as George Peters. He carried a clipboard and moved through the house with an attentiveness that felt almost reverent. He tapped along the baseboards, checked outlets, and leaned into the attic with a flashlight. "Strong bones," he said, jotting down notes. "Roof is solid. Minor caulking upstairs. Nothing serious. Whoever acquires this place will have something worth preserving." I trailed them from room to room, more observer than host, listening to George's observations while Helen nodded. When we stepped back outside, she paused beneath the rhododendrons, their hue still striking against the weathered fence. "I may already have the right buyers," she said. "Aaron and Lena Dane, originally from Oregon, just relocated back from Arizona. They lost their only son 2 years ago and have been searching for a place that feels rooted, not staged. They want a house with history." Something in her tone told me she believed they were destined for this place. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. By late afternoon, while I was organizing another drawer of papers, Mark Bell's name appeared in my inbox. The subject line read simply, "Additional document." I opened the attachment and found a scanned letter. Arthur's handwriting was immediately familiar. It was a side agreement drafted during the original title changes, a clause I'd forgotten we even discussed. It granted me unilateral authority to sell under hardship or if continued co-ownership proved untenable. The words were simple, but the effect was profound. Michael's ability to obstruct had been cut off at the root years ago, though neither of us remembered it until now. Arthur had planned ahead, protecting me in ways I hadn't recognized. I read the letter twice, my throat tightening, not from sorrow, but from something steadier. Relief. I printed the document and placed it on top of the growing file, the evidence of a life measured in signatures and receipts. For the first time since the porch ultimatum, I felt the ground beneath me level out. Arthur had left me one last safeguard, and it was enough. The next day, Helen would bring the Danes for a private showing. Helen arrived just before noon with the Danes in tow. Lena stepped into the kitchen first, her hand brushing over the pantry doors, fingers pausing on the mismatched knobs Arthur had picked up at a garage sale. "These have character," she murmured, smiling at me as though I had done her a favor by leaving them there. Aaron moved more slowly, drawn to the back windows. When he stepped outside, he lingered under the rhododendrons, touching the blossoms gently as if they were fragile relics. They walked the rooms without haste, never once treating the house like inventory to be measured and replaced. In the living room, Lena asked where the armchair used to be. She could sense a void in the space. I told her about the hours I spent reading there, about Arthur dozing off with crossword puzzles balanced on his knees. She listened the way a daughter would, not a stranger. When the tour concluded, Helen led us back to the kitchen. She set her clipboard on the table and spoke with a calm that carried no doubt. She said they're prepared to make a full price offer. Cash, no contingencies, expedited escrow. They'd like to close before the end of the month. I didn't need to deliberate. The files were already stacked neatly beside me, Arthur's side letter on top. I slid it aside to make room for the contract. Lena looked at me with quiet gratitude, as though my decision offered her not just a house, but a chance to begin anew. I signed each page carefully, my pen steady, my name firm. By the time I set it down, the house was no longer mine in waiting. It was theirs in promise. An hour later, as Helen drove off with the paperwork, my phone lit up with Michael's name. "What are you doing? Stop this. We need to talk." The text came in bursts, each more frantic than the last. I placed the phone face down on the table. Eleanor's message followed, long clipped sentences crafted like a corporate memo. "This destabilizes the family structure. You're creating unnecessary confusion for Olivia. We can't condone such reckless behavior." I read it once, then forwarded both messages and the executed documents to Mark with a short note. "Proceed as planned." The late afternoon light stretched across the floor, thin and golden, the same way it had when I carried boxes through this room for the first time. I stood by the window and watched shadows lengthen across the yard where Arthur once built Michael a treehouse. The branches were bare now, the planks long gone, but the shape of what once stood remained. By sunset, the house was on its way to new hands, and for the first time in years, I felt the air inside loosen around me, making space for what came next.
It was nearly dark when I saw his silhouette on the porch. Michael knocked once, softly, the way he did as a boy when he'd come home late and didn't want Arthur to hear. I opened the door before he could knock again. He looked smaller in the frame, shoulders hunched, tie loosened, eyes darting past me into the house like he wasn't sure if he was still welcome. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped aside. He sat at the kitchen table, the same chair Arthur always claimed, and folded his hands as if waiting for a reprimand. "Mom, this doesn't have to happen like this," he began. "The sale, it makes us all look bad. Just give it time. Let people forget about the incident. Then we can figure something out." I watched him struggle with the word apology, but he never said it. Instead, he leaned forward, voice dropping. "Maybe Mom didn't—" His sentence dangled in the air, the defense I'd been waiting to hear years. But just as quickly, he pulled back. "Anyway, appearances matter. For Olivia, for all of us." I stood, crossed to the drawer, and pulled out the folder I had prepared. I laid each page across the table. Decades of property tax receipts, repair invoices in my name, bank statements showing every mortgage payment I had carried since Arthur died. On top, I placed the boutique receipt for Eleanor's dress, dated the day before that barbecue, with a notation in neat handwriting, "Repaired seam, no charge." Michael glanced at it, then away, his jaw tight. The truth lay between us, undeniable, but he refused to touch it. "You knew she twisted it," I said evenly, "and you let her. You stood on that porch and let her ban me from my own house." His face tightened. "It's complicated." "It isn't," I answered. "I won't apologize for keeping this house alive. I won't apologize for paying the bills, for preserving what your father and I built. Not to her, and not to you." He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping across the floor, but he didn't argue. He simply stood there, deflated, like a man who had come expecting to win something and left knowing he never could. The screen door banged behind him, and silence filled the kitchen again. I gathered the receipts into their folder and placed them back in the drawer. The papers were no longer weapons. They were simply records of a truth I no longer needed anyone else to name. The next morning I woke before dawn with a steadiness that surprised me, and I began preparing for my meeting at the bank. At the bank, Ethan greeted me with the same quiet politeness he had shown when he first explained the deed. We sat in a glass-walled office as I laid out the paperwork, and together we structured the trust. Every clause was deliberate. Funds protected, long-term interest, no signatures required but Olivia's when the time came. I signed with a steady hand. The pen did not shake. That weekend, Olivia drove up from Corvallis with a paper bag of warm scones she had bought along the way. She looked older than 22 in that moment, hair pulled back, eyes wary but kind. We sat at my kitchen table, the one that would soon belong to someone else, and I slid a small key across the surface. She picked it up, confused. "What's this?" "The safety deposit box," I told her. "Everything you'll need someday is inside. Not now, not yet. But when it's yours, you won't have to ask anyone's permission." Her lips parted, her voice hesitant. "Did you do all this for me?" I held her gaze. "I did it for me, and I included you because you never made me small." She reached for my hand, squeezing it with a seriousness that told me she understood more than she wanted to admit. The next day, Mark forwarded me a copy of Eleanor's final maneuver, an email she had sent to Michael's supervisor, hinting at family instability. Mark's reply had been sharp and efficient. "Cease all attempts to interfere with a valid transaction or face exposure." After that, the inbox went quiet. I closed my laptop, relieved by the silence. What mattered had already been secured, not in walls or deeds, but in the line of trust that now ran through my granddaughter's hands. The cottage on the coast was waiting. The call came mid-morning. Escrow had recorded. The wire confirmed the sale was complete. I folded the phone shut, stood at the window for a long moment, then gathered my bag. The house on Oak Ridge Avenue was no longer mine. Highway 22 carried me west through rolling farmland, fields turning toward autumn, the air thick with cut hay. As the road climbed into the coast range, mist gathered along the pines, and by the time I descended toward Newport, the Aquina Bay Bridge rose out of fog like a memory surfacing. The cottage I had rented sat a few blocks from the harbor. When I opened the door, the smell of cedar and salt met me first, clean and unclaimed. I set my bag down and let the silence settle. That evening, I took out paper and wrote 2 letters. The first was addressed to Michael, though I never planned to send it. "You didn't do one unforgivable thing. You did 100 forgettable ones, and I will not carry them anymore." The second I sealed and addressed to Olivia. "We are not defined by wrongs we shrink inside, but the ones we refuse. Remember that when the day comes, you must choose your own door." Later, in a plain spiral journal, I wrote 3 lines, steady and final. "I am not a burden. I am not a backup plan. I am not sorry." I placed the pen aside, unlatched the window, and let the ocean air fill the room. The tide was moving in, and with it came the sound of waves against stone, patient and sure, carrying me into whatever waited beyond this new threshold.